Gloria Vanderbilt inherited one of the greatest fortunes in American history before she was old enough to speak. She had a name that meant something in every country in the world, a mother who fought a public legal war to keep her and then disappeared, an aunt who won that war and treated the prize like an obligation, 4 husbands, 2 sons, one tragedy so devastating that the people who witnessed it said she was never quite the same afterward, and a life so relentlessly dramatic that when she finally sat down in her 80s to try to make sense of it, she said that even she could not quite believe it had all happened to one person. What Gloria Vanderbilt actually went through from the moment she was born into that name to the moment she left it behind, what she built, what she lost, and what she was still trying to understand at the end of her life, that is the story we are telling today. But before we get to any of that, before the custody battle that made front-page news across the country, and the marriages, and the tragedy, and the career she built out of nothing when she had everything, you need to understand what the Vanderbilt name actually meant. Because without that context, the rest of it does not land with the weight it deserves. Cornelius Vanderbilt was born in 1794 in Staten Island, New York, to a farming family with no particular money and no particular prospects. He left school at 11. By the time he died in 1877, he had built a railroad and shipping empire that made him the wealthiest man in America and one of the wealthiest individuals in the history of the modern world. His fortune at the time of his death was estimated at $100 million, which in 1877 represented approximately 1% of the entire gross domestic product of the United States. He was not simply rich. He was rich in a way that had no real precedent in American life, and very few precedents anywhere else. What happened to that fortune in the generations that followed is a study in what inherited money does to a family over time. The short version is that the Vanderbilts spent it. Not carelessly exactly, but with a sustained commitment to grandeur that their descendants would eventually be unable to maintain. The mansions on Fifth Avenue, the Newport cottages, which were not cottages by any definition that word has ever carried, but palaces the size of small villages built for summer use, the parties, the horses, the jewels, the transatlantic steamers. The Vanderbilts of the second and third generation spent their inheritance with an enthusiasm that would have appalled the old Commodore who had accumulated it. And by the time the fourth generation arrived, the vast original fortune had been divided and subdivided and spent down to a fraction of what it had been. Gloria Vanderbilt was of the fourth generation. Her father was Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt, the youngest son of Cornelius Vanderbilt II, who was the Commodore's grandson. Reginald was charming and handsome, and entirely without the discipline that had created the family's wealth. He drank. He gambled. He spent money with a fluency and consistency that suggested he had never seriously considered the possibility that it might run out. By the time he married Gloria Morgan in 1923, Reginald Vanderbilt was already a diminished version of what the name implied. He was 42. She was 18. He was attracted to her beauty and her youth. She was attracted to the name and what remained of the fortune. What remained was still substantial. Reginald left an estate worth approximately $5 million when he died, which in 1925 was enough to secure a very comfortable life. But it was nowhere near the Vanderbilt fortune of legend. The glory was already historical by the time Gloria was born. She was born on February 20th, 1924, in New York City. Her father died on September 4th, 1925. She was 18 months old. And here is the first thing you need to hold in your mind as this story unfolds, because it is the thing that shapes everything that comes after. Gloria Vanderbilt lost her father before she had any memory of him. She was born into enormous privilege and immediate loss in the same breath, and the loss, as it turned out, was only the beginning. Now, you might think that an 18-month-old child left fatherless, but with a substantial inheritance and a famous name would be protected. That the adults around her would make sure she was stable and loved and shielded from anything that might harm her further. What actually happened is so far from that assumption that the story of Gloria Vanderbilt's childhood reads less like the biography of an heiress than like the transcript of a disaster that nobody in authority bothered to stop. And to understand how it became a disaster, you need to understand the two women who were about to fight over her. Because the custody battle that would consume the next decade of Gloria's life and make her childhood one of the most scrutinized in American legal history was not really a battle about what was best for a little girl. It was a battle between two women who had almost nothing in common except the name they were both connected to and the child who sat between them. The first woman was her mother. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt was 21 years old when her husband died. She was beautiful and social, and genuinely unprepared for the obligations of single motherhood, particularly single motherhood in the specific form it took when you were a Vanderbilt widow with a famous child and a trust fund that paid you an allowance on the condition that the child remained alive and in your care. She did not, by any account that history has preserved, find motherhood natural or particularly interesting. She left Gloria in the care of a nurse named Emma Keislich, who was known to everyone as Dodo, and she travelled. She went to Europe. She attended parties. She moved through the social world that her youth and her beauty and her husband's name made available to her. She was not a monster. She was a young woman who had been placed in a situation she had not chosen and had responded by largely removing herself from it. The second woman was her sister-in-law. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney was everything that Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt was not. She was 58 years old in 1932 when the legal proceedings began. She was a sculptor of genuine accomplishment and the founder of the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York, which she had established in 1930 to exhibit the work of American artists who were being ignored by the established institutions. She was formidable. She was wealthy in her own right. She was serious about art, and serious about culture, and serious about the obligations of the Vanderbilt name in ways that Reginald had never been, and that his young widow had no interest in being. Gertrude was also, it should be said, not a warm woman in the conventional sense. She was not the kind of aunt who swept in with affection and baked things and made a child feel seen. She was a woman of enormous competence and enormous distance, someone who believed that the correct thing to do with a neglected child was to provide her with structure and staff and education and appropriate exposure to culture, which is not quite the same as love. But here is what you need to keep in mind as this part of the story unfolds. Gloria Vanderbilt was 8 years old when the custody battle began in public. She was 10 when it ended, and for those 2 years she sat at the center of a legal and media spectacle that put her mother's behavior, her mother's friends, her mother's finances, and her mother's fitness as a parent on the front page of every major newspaper in the country. She was a child. She was in the courtroom. She was asked to choose. And what happened to her in that courtroom? And what the choice cost her? And what she spent the rest of her life trying to recover from? That is where this story is really going. But we are not quite there yet. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt had been living in Europe for much of the period between her husband's death in 1925 and the beginning of the legal proceedings in 1934. She had taken Gloria with her sometimes and left her with the nurse, always, and she had built a life in Paris and London that had very little room in it for the specific demands of raising a small child. She had spent more of the trust money than the terms of the trust were designed to allow. She had kept company that the Vanderbilt family's lawyers found troubling. There were rumors, documented in the legal proceedings, of parties that were not suitable environments for a young girl. There was testimony about the nurse, Dodo, who had formed the closest attachment to Gloria of any adult in her life, and whose influence over the child some found excessive. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney filed for custody in 1934. The case went to trial in the fall of that year. And what followed was something that the American press had never quite seen before. A custody trial that played out like a theatrical event, with daily coverage, with testimony from society figures and nurses and doctors, with allegations about the mother's conduct that were specific and damaging, with a child sitting in the middle of it all being asked in the most indirect and then increasingly direct ways what she wanted and who she loved and where she felt safe. The testimony that came out of the trial was extraordinary. Witnesses described Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt as a mother who was largely absent, who spent her allowance on clothes and travel and entertainment, while her daughter was raised almost entirely by a hired nurse, who brought her daughter into social environments that were not appropriate for a child, and who demonstrated in a dozen documented ways that her primary relationship was not with her daughter, but with the life that her daughter's trust fund made possible for her. The defense painted a different picture. A young woman widowed at 21, doing her best under impossible circumstances, criticized by a wealthy and powerful family for having the audacity to live her life rather than disappear into grief and obligation. The Vanderbilt family, the defense suggested, was not motivated by concern for a little girl. They were motivated by the desire to control the Vanderbilt name and the Vanderbilt money and the Vanderbilt narrative, and Gloria Morgan was simply standing in their way. Both of these things were probably partially true, but the child in the courtroom did not have access to that kind of nuance. She was 10 years old. She had been cared for her entire conscious life by a nurse she adored. Her mother was a beautiful and remote figure who appeared and disappeared without predictability. Her aunt was a formidable and accomplished woman who offered stability and structure and a kind of cold reliability that was different from love, but was at least consistent. When Gloria was brought before the judge and asked, in private, where she wanted to live, she said she wanted to live with her aunt. She said she was afraid of her mother. She said she did not feel safe. These statements, made by a 10-year-old child in a private chamber, became part of the public record. Her mother read them in the newspaper. And what that moment did to the relationship between Gloria Vanderbilt and her mother, and what it did to Gloria's own understanding of herself and her capacity to love and be loved, is something that ran like a current through every relationship she had for the rest of her life. Gertrude Whitney won custody in November of 1934. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt was granted visitation rights, limited and supervised. The child who had been at the center of the most publicized custody battle in American history went to live with her aunt at a house in Old Westbury, Long Island, and the mother she had told a judge she was afraid of became a visitor in her own daughter's life. Now, here is the part that the straightforward telling of the custody battle tends to skip over, because what you might expect after a child has been awarded to a stable and serious and wealthy aunt and removed from the orbit of a neglectful mother is that the child would settle, would exhale, would begin to feel safe in the way that the court proceedings had implied she should feel safe. Gloria Vanderbilt did not feel safe. She felt orphaned twice. The first time when her father died before she knew him. The second time when a judge decided that the mother she had complicated feelings about was no longer her primary parent. Gertrude Whitney was not unkind, but she was not warm in the way that a motherless 10-year-old needed someone to be warm. She had her own life and her own work and her own obligations, and Gloria was one of them. She was provided for, she was educated, she was dressed appropriately and taken to appropriate cultural events and given everything that money and organization could provide. She was profoundly lonely. The nurse, Dodo, remained in her life for a period. And that relationship was the closest thing to unconditional love that Gloria had consistent access to as a child. But Dodo was an employee, and employees are eventually let go or move on or have their own lives that pull them in other directions. And when that primary attachment was disrupted, the disruption registered at a depth that the adults around Gloria were not equipped to recognize or address. And her mother. The relationship with her mother after the custody battle was one of the most painful and enduring complications of Gloria Vanderbilt's emotional life. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt did not disappear entirely. She appeared for the supervised visits. She was still beautiful and still glamorous, and still the kind of woman who filled a room when she entered it. And Gloria, who had told a judge she was afraid of her, spent years afterward trying to understand what she had actually meant by that, and whether it was true, and whether she had been manipulated into saying it by the adults around her, who had their own reasons for wanting Gertrude to win. She wrote about this in her memoir. She returned to it again and again across her life. The question of whether she had betrayed her mother in that judge's chamber, whether a 10-year-old child could be said to have betrayed anyone, whether the fear was real or constructed, and what it meant that she had spent her adult life looking for the love that her mother had been unable to give her in every subsequent relationship she entered. That is not a small psychological inheritance. That is the foundation on which every marriage and every love affair and every friendship Gloria Vanderbilt ever built was standing. And it explains, more than anything else, what comes next. She turned 17 in 1941. She was at a school in California, Westlake School for Girls, living far from both her mother and her aunt, which had become her characteristic arrangement, moving between the two women without being fully at home with either. She was extraordinarily beautiful. She had Vanderbilt money and a Vanderbilt name, and the kind of looks that made people pay attention to her the moment she entered a room. She was also, underneath all of that, a girl who had been fought over and examined and documented and discussed by the public for years before she was old enough to form her own opinions about any of it, and who had grown up without the steady, unconditional presence of a parent who simply loved her without the weight of a legal battle or an inheritance or a family name attached to the love. The first marriage arrived quickly. Pasquale Di Cicco was 32 years old when he married 17-year-old Gloria Vanderbilt in December of 1941. He was a Hollywood agent with a peripheral connection to the film industry and a direct connection to organized crime figures that his new wife's family found alarming, and that Gloria herself would later describe with the kind of clarity that only comes after enough time has passed. The marriage was, in the most fundamental sense, a 17-year-old girl mistaking intensity for love and attention for safety. Di Cicco was controlling and volatile. There were accusations of physical violence. There was a sustained pattern of behavior that Gloria later described plainly as abuse. She stayed 4 years. She left in 1945. She was 21 years old, and she had already been through more than most people accumulate in a lifetime, and she was just beginning. What happens next is where the story takes a turn that nobody who had been following the trajectory of a neglected heiress married too young to the wrong man would have predicted. Because the second husband was not a mistake. The second husband was, by every account Gloria ever gave, the great love of her young life, the relationship that shaped what she understood love to be, and the one she would spend decades measuring every subsequent relationship against. His name was Leopold Stokowski. He was 63 years old when they married. Gloria was 21. He was one of the most celebrated conductors in the world, the man who had led the Philadelphia Orchestra for a generation and who had collaborated with Walt Disney on Fantasia. He was a man of genuine intellectual distinction and enormous artistic authority. And he looked at Gloria Vanderbilt with a seriousness and a completeness that she had almost never experienced from anyone. The age gap was 42 years. The marriage lasted 9 years and produced two sons, Stan, born in 1950, and Christopher, born in 1952. By the time it ended in divorce in 1955, Gloria was 31, and she had spent her marriage discovering what it felt like to be fully seen by someone, which is not a minor thing when you have spent your childhood being looked at without being seen. The end of the marriage hurt her in a way that she was clear about later, not because she had not seen it coming, but because what she had found in it was something she was not sure she would find again. She found it again almost immediately. Wyatt Cooper was a writer and actor from Mississippi, handsome and warm and genuinely interested in the world, and genuinely interested in Gloria in a way that felt different from the intensity of Stokowski and the violence of DiCicco. He was 7 years younger than her. They married in December of 1963 after she had completed a third marriage to director Sidney Lumet, which had lasted from 1956 to 1963, and which she described in later years as a relationship she had entered too quickly and left when she understood that quickly was the problem. With Wyatt Cooper, she had the marriage she had been moving toward through all the previous ones. They had two sons together, Carter, born in 1965, and Anderson, born in 1967. The household they built in New York was by every account a genuinely warm one. Cooper was present and funny, and engaged in the way that fathers are engaged when they actually want to be there. Gloria had the family she had been trying to construct since childhood. She had the stable center that had been missing from everything before. And here is where you need to pay attention, because this is the moment in the story where the thing you are waiting for begins to take shape. Not the tragedy itself, not yet, but the conditions that would make the tragedy so devastating when it came. Because Gloria Vanderbilt had finally built something real. She had 4 sons across 2 marriages, a husband who loved her, a creative life that was beginning to take serious shape, and for the first time since she was 18 months old, she was not waiting for the loss. She was living in the thing itself. She had always made art. From early in her life, she had drawn and painted, and worked with fabric and mixed media in ways that were serious, even when the world around her was treating her primarily as a famous name and a beautiful face. She was not simply an heiress who dabbled. She had real talent and a real visual intelligence and a real commitment to the work that existed independently of her celebrity. In the 1970s, that commitment found its commercial form. The Gloria Vanderbilt jeans launched in 1976. They were not the first designer jeans on the American market, but they were among the first to put a famous name on the back pocket and sell the name as the product rather than the denim. The campaign was direct and deliberate. Gloria Vanderbilt was the brand, the face, the name, the legend, the heiress who had been a famous child and was now a famous adult. All of it collapsed into a pair of jeans that sold more than 200 million pairs over the course of the brand's commercial life. She became, almost overnight, one of the most recognizable names in American fashion. She was wealthy in a way that was hers, not inherited, not managed by trustees, not contingent on a custody arrangement or a husband's income. She had built it herself. But stay with the family for a moment, because that is where the real story is still unfolding, and because what is coming in 1978 is the loss that reoriented everything. Wyatt Cooper died in January of 1978 during open heart surgery. He was 50 years old. The surgery was planned, and the risks were understood. And it was still a shock in the way that losing someone always is, even when you have told yourself you are prepared. Gloria was 53. Carter was 12. Anderson was 10. and the family that had finally felt stable and warm and whole was suddenly a household with a missing center, two young boys trying to understand what had just happened, and a woman who had lost more people than most people lose in a full life, and who now had to find a way to continue without the man who had made. Continuing feel possible. She continued. She kept working. She kept making art. She raised Carter and Anderson in the apartment on East 67th Street, where she had lived with Wyatt and where every room carried the weight of his absence. She wrote about him. She wrote about the marriage and the loss and the specific texture of grief when the person you have lost is the person you had finally allowed yourself to fully trust. She was not someone who performed composure in the way that the women of certain families perform composure. She said what things felt like. She put the interior life on paper, and she did it with a directness that the people who had only known her as a famous name found startling. And then 1988 arrived. And what happened in 1988 is the thing that, by everyone who knew Gloria Vanderbilt and by Gloria Vanderbilt herself, changed her permanently in some part of her that never fully healed. Carter Cooper was 23 years old on July 22nd, 1988. He was a young man who had grown up as the son of Gloria Vanderbilt and Wyatt Cooper in an apartment on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, who had lost his father at 12, who was by the accounts of people who knew him warm and intelligent and struggling with something that the people closest to him had been worried about without fully understanding. He had been showing signs of distress in the days before. He had been behaving in ways that the people around him recognized as alarming, but that none of them had the framework to intervene effectively in the specific moment that required intervention. On July 22nd, in the apartment where Gloria was present, Carter went to the terrace of the 14th floor, and he jumped. Gloria was there. She witnessed it. She was close enough that she tried to hold him back, and could not. The details of what she saw are in the record because she spoke about them eventually, in the way that she spoke about everything that had shaped her, directly and without the protective distance that some people maintain between themselves and the worst things they have experienced. She did not maintain that distance. She named what had happened, and she lived inside the naming of it, and she carried it forward in a way that the people who loved her said was the most remarkable and the most devastating thing they had ever witnessed in a person. Anderson Cooper was 21 years old when his brother died. He has spoken about that loss with a consistency and an openness across his career as a journalist and broadcaster that has made it part of the public record in a way that few family tragedies are. He has said that his brother's death changed his understanding of the fragility of life in a way that nothing before or since has come close to. He has said that it changed his relationship with his mother, that the two of them became each other's primary witness in the years after Carter died, each one carrying something that the other was the only person on Earth fully equipped to understand. What Gloria Vanderbilt did after 1988 is in some ways the most remarkable part of her story, because what she did was not retreat. She was 64 years old. She had lost her father, her primary childhood attachment, her most significant early love, her best marriage, and now her son. And she did not retreat. She kept making art. She kept writing. She became, if anything, more direct and more honest and more willing to put the hardest things in the room on the page than she had been before. She published a memoir. She painted in series that addressed loss and grief and survival, with a visual honesty that critics who had been dismissive of her work when she was primarily a celebrity began to take seriously. She spoke about Carter in interviews with a willingness to be fully present in the pain of it that people found simultaneously devastating and somehow fortifying. She was not performing grief. She was living in it and making things out of it, which is the only thing some people know how to do with the worst experiences of their lives, and which, in Gloria's case, had been her practice since childhood. She and Anderson Cooper conducted a series of conversations that became a book published in 2016 called The Rainbow Comes and Goes. It was an exchange of letters between a mother and a son, written over the course of a year, in which they asked each other the questions they had not asked before, and said the things they had not said, and looked at the history of the family they had been together, and tried to understand what it meant and what it had made each of them into. It is one of the most honest documents of a mother-son relationship in American publishing. It is also one of the more remarkable things Gloria Vanderbilt ever made, which is a high bar given that her life was full of remarkable things. In those letters, she talked about her childhood, about the custody battle and the feeling of being fought over without being loved properly by either side, about the nurse Dodo and what it meant to have your primary attachment be someone who was paid to be there, about her mother, Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt, who had become in old age a figure that Gloria could look at with more complexity and more compassion than she had been able to when she was young, and still trying to understand whether she had been abandoned or protected, or simply caught between two forces that had nothing to do with her. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt died in 1965. The reconciliation that took place in the years before her death was partial and complicated and real. It was not a Hollywood ending. It was not a moment of catharsis in which all the old wounds closed. It was two women who had hurt each other, one through absence and one through public testimony, trying to find their way to something that was honest before it was too late. Gloria Vanderbilt said in later interviews that she regretted the years they had lost, and that she also understood, from the perspective of an adult who had been through enough to have complicated feelings about motherhood herself, that her mother had been a young woman without the resources, emotional or otherwise, to be the parent Gloria had needed. That understanding did not erase the childhood, but it changed what she did with it. And what she did with it, for the last decades of her life, was make art and tell the truth and stay close to her surviving sons and refuse to allow the accumulated weight of what she had lived through to be the last word on who she was. She had been given a name before she could speak, a name that came with money and mythology and a custody battle and a childhood of being looked at without being seen. She had been married 4 times and widowed once and divorced 3 times, and had searched in each marriage for the thing that the first loss had taken, which was simply the uncomplicated love of a parent who stays. She had found versions of that in Stokowski and a fuller version in Wyatt Cooper, and she had lost Cooper before she was ready, which is always before you are ready. She had watched her son die and stayed present in the world afterward, making things. She was diagnosed with advanced stomach cancer in June of 2019. She was 95 years old. Anderson Cooper was with her when she was told. She was, by his account, characteristically direct about it. She did not ask how long she had. She asked what the options were and was told they were limited, and she looked at her son and she said she was ready. She died on June 17th, 2019. Anderson Cooper announced her death on CNN, live, while he was on air. It was the kind of moment that was entirely consistent with the particular relationship they had built in the years after 1988, which was a relationship premised on honesty and presence, and the refusal to pretend that the hard things were not happening. He said she was a force of nature. He said she was the most creative person he had ever known. He said that she had shown him that loss was not the end of anything, that you could lose the people who mattered most to you and still keep moving and still keep making things and still keep finding reasons to be in the world. He said she had given him that, and he did not know what he would do without it. She left behind an estate that was considerably smaller than the Vanderbilt fortune she had been born into. She left behind sons and grandchildren, and an art practice that spanned 7 decades, and a memoir that is one of the more honest accounts of a complicated American life. She left behind the jeans, and the collaborations, and the fashion work, and the painting, and the fabric collages, and all the other forms her making had taken across the years. She left behind the book she had made with Anderson, which is a record of two people who had been through a great deal together, deciding to say what it had all meant before the time to say it ran out. What she also left behind, though this is harder to measure, is a particular example of what you do when the name you are given and the losses you accumulate threaten to become the whole story. What you do is refuse that. You make something. You tell the truth about what it cost. You stay in the world, even when the world has given you every reason to withdraw from it. You keep the love visible, even when the love has been the source of the most devastating pain. Gloria Vanderbilt was given everything, and she was given almost nothing in the same moment. She was given a name that opened every door, and a childhood that taught her that doors opening is not the same as being welcomed. She was given money and beauty, and a succession of men who loved her in different ways and with different capacities, and a son who looked at her the way Wyatt Cooper had looked at her, which is to say, with full attention and genuine admiration and the particular love that survives the worst things. She was also given losses that would have made smaller people smaller. They did not make her smaller. They made her, if anything, more insistent on the things that mattered, more direct, more willing to say the hard thing, more committed to the work, more honest about the cost of a life that had been, from its first moment, both extraordinary and entirely too much to carry alone. She did not carry it alone in the end. She carried it with Anderson, and before Anderson, she had carried it with Wyatt, and before that, she had carried it in the only way available to her, which was by herself, in the schools and the houses and the courtrooms and the apartments where the people who were supposed to love her either could not, or would not, or did not know how. The custody battle is over. The marriages are history. The genes have their place in the record. But the thing that matters, the thing worth sitting with when you think about Gloria Vanderbilt, is not the name or the money or the famous face. It is the fact that she was handed a story that could have ended in bitterness or silence, or the kind of permanent withdrawal that a life of that much loss would have justified, and she refused that ending. She kept making things. She kept telling the truth. She kept showing up. That is not nothing. For someone who started with everything and lost so much of it, that is everything. If you found this video worthwhile, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more stories like this one.